and I'm very proud to have been part of many, many years of them. Hope that next year we can all be together again. Well, as Amanda told you, I was born in Budapest, Hungary in 1933, and that was the same year that Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. It's a very notable year for that, you know. Anyhow, I was born to parents after 8 years of marriage. My story went that my parents very much wanted a child for a long time. And when I came into this world, my father was so happy that he got a little girl, he gave the doctor an extra $100. I don't know if that story is true, but it certainly made the little girl feel very, very good. I had a set of grandparents on my mother's side who lived in a small town about an hour's train ride from Budapest. It was called Rákosliget, and it was almost a mini farm. Grandma raised chickens, ducks, and geese, and she grew vegetables and beautiful flowers, and the aroma from the fruit trees were wonderfully overwhelming. I spent many, many happy hours with Grandma and Grandpa, especially during summer vacations. My mother also had a sister who was older than she was, but she was childless. So I was Elsa's baby too. Elsa was a wonderful seamstress. She made all my clothes. And after I started going to school, all the kids wanted to know where my mother got my clothes. So all in all, the entire world revolved around me. I was lucky enough to have been born to relatively affluent parents because I remember some very nice vacations we took. In the summertime on beautiful Lake Balaton, my parents and their friends, and in the wintertime in the ski chalets of the Kékes Mountains. And otherwise, the rest of the summer, I was with Grandma and Grandpa. Now, besides this wonderful family I had, my parents owned a haberdashery business whereby they sold yard goods to tailors who made custom-made suits with all the accessories. And my mom was a working lady way back then and worked with my dad in the store. So because she was gone all day, we had a live-in housekeeper. Her name was Julia. And Julia, well, I don't remember life without Julia. I must have been very young when she started working for us. But Julia cooked delicious meals and cleaned the house and took me to the park and played with me. And she very quickly became part of the family. So I'm telling you all this because my early childhood was so happy, and then the roof caved in. Even before I started to go to school, my mother started impressing on me that I had to do very well in school. I said, why? And she explained that because of a law, only 1% of a college class could be made up of Jews. So if you were not at the top of your class, it was impossible to get into university. Now, my mother had two more sisters who had immigrated to the United States long before I was born. I only knew of them. I never met them. And Etta, her older sister, became a physician, and she also married a physician. And they were the first ones to come to Chicago. And my mother, I think, wanted me to walk in Etta's footsteps and would have liked me to become a doctor also. So now I got enrolled in school, and well, I went to a Catholic girls' school, and I had no idea why. And today I can come up with two ideas. Perhaps it was the best education in the area, and well, maybe it was safer to send a Jewish little girl to a Catholic school. I have no idea. But there were several other Jewish little girls with me. Every morning we studied the New Testament, so I became very well versed with that. And later on, that helped me it helped save my life. And we had a teacher who came in to teach us, the Jewish children, our religion a couple times a week. So obviously there was no separation of church and state as we know it in the United States. I felt absolutely no anti-Semitism at school. As a matter of fact, I knew very little of anti-Semitism because my parents really were very careful not to listen to the news within earshot of me. So I knew there was a war, but I had no idea what anti-Semitism was, and I had no idea who was fighting who. And one day I came home from school and I said, you know, there's a strange looking flag on this big building that I have to pass when I go to school. And my parents looked at each other and they explained to me that, well, that was the headquarters of the Hungarian Nazi Party. It was called the Arrow Cross. And of course, the symbol on it was a swastika. But up until then, I had never even seen a swastika. While we were in school, we all got along very well. Looking back, after school, the Catholic kids and the Jewish kids never played together. We never mingled. Our Jewish kids have their own friends, and so did the Catholic ones. Now, the Hungarian school system was such that you went to school for 4 years, and then you graduated. And then it depended on your grades. If your grades were good enough, you could go on to a gymnasium, which was a college preparatory school of 8 years. Or if your grades were not good enough, then you had to go to a Polgari, which was a 4-year trade school, so you could go out in the world and make a living. And after graduation, I remember wearing a red dress with white polka dots. That was the uniform of the day. We all wore that to our graduation. So my mom and I went to look at a list posted on the front door of the school. And it was a list of who made it into the gymnasium. And tears of joy ran down my mother's face because my name was among those who were going now to the Jewish gymnasium, along with several of my little friends. By this time, the Allies were bombing, but virtually always in the dark of night. And the air raid sirens would go off, and we would grab some warm clothes and head for the basement. I lived in a 3-story apartment building, and we all headed for the basement. And while there, everybody was extremely fearful. The building trembled, it shook. But then the all clear signal came on, and we all picked up and went back upstairs and went to bed. And this became such a routine that in the morning, after a bombing like that, I got up, I got dressed, my parents got dressed, they went to work, and I went to school. And life went on like that until March 1944, when the Germans, as the last-ditch effort, because the war was coming to an end and they were losing it, they sent Hitler sent Adolf Eichmann to finish the Hungarian Jews, to do the final solution of eradicating the European Judaism. And that's when our lives totally changed for all of us. The first thing I can tell you is that I had to wear a yellow star, 10 centimeters in diameter, and stitch on sufficiently that you couldn't put a pencil between the stitches. Fear was etched on everybody's face. My parents must have heard of the atrocities in the outlying areas. I had no idea because they moved Grandma and Grandpa in to live with us because they felt that nothing like that could happen in the big city. My dad lost his business and I had to stop going to school. And in June, a new anti-Jewish law was enacted, and that meant that all the Jews had to move into certain buildings. They were called Jewish designated buildings or Yellow Star buildings, both meaning the same thing. This building was only a couple blocks from where we had lived, but we could only take what we could carry. And we were shown to a 2-bedroom apartment. And in one bedroom lived, as I remember, an elderly lady. But then I was 11 years old, so everybody over 40 is elderly, of course, and her middle-aged daughter. And in the other bedroom were Grandma, Grandpa, Mom, and Dad, and myself. We were crowded, but we were together. I was very lucky because I was with always somebody I knew would take care of me. Most Jewish children were torn away from their parents, and I can't even imagine the fear they experienced before they would put to their deaths because the Nazis had no use for Jewish children to grow up. Now, later on, we found out that within a matter of 45 days, all the Jews from the outlying areas, except the Budapest Jews, had been deported to various concentration camps. So it's a good thing that my dad moved Grandma and Grandpa in with us. The worst thing as a child for me, well, I went to sleep the first night in this new place, and I woke up in the morning with big red welts all over me, and they were itching like crazy, and I was scratching, and I said, what is this? And it turned out that the place was infested with bed bugs. There was no getting rid of them. This scenario took place night after night, and there was nothing we could do about it. There was a law that all the bathtubs had to be filled with water. Probably if there was a bombing, there should be water available. And there's 2 ladies in the other room used to go during the night and shake their nighties into the bathtub. And I got up in the morning to a floating bed of bed bugs. It really was a very unappetizing sight. Food was becoming scarce. Well, my mom was always a businesswoman. She was never a cook, but Grandma was there. And she made the best of whatever she could find. The problem was that Jews were only allowed to go to the store after 4 o'clock. And by that time, the shelves were pretty much cleaned out. A lot of people had been out of work for several months. They didn't have the money to buy any groceries, and others, well, even if they had the money, there wasn't much to buy. But somehow Grandma always managed to put some food on the table. And to this day, I'm not sure whether the grown-ups gave me their share, but I never went hungry. I may not have eaten what I wanted, but I never went hungry. My grandfather had been ill, and now he was so sick that we couldn't keep him at home. And all of us went and took him to a so-called hospital. And I bet most of you are old enough to have seen MASH or some old wartime movies where you saw the cots lined up one next to the other. And that's the way I remember my grandfather for the last time I ever saw him. None of us ever found out whether he died of natural causes, he was starved to death, or he was killed. To this day, I don't know. But there was still Grandma and Mom and Dad. And then one day, a group of Nazis marched into our building, and a gunshot rang out into the air. And they ordered all men, working age men like 18 through 45, to line up downstairs. My dad had this beautiful, well, my mother and father were always dressed beautifully because the tailors all made their coats and suits. So my dad put on this beautiful custom-made winter coat, and Budapest winters are cold Midwestern winters with snow. So he had a pair of boots on, and everybody had a little knapsack ready by order. And you know, the Nazis told many, many lies. But one of the biggest lies that stands out in my mind was that they told the rest of the population in the building that they're only taking these people to work and they're bringing them back. And that helped calm the rest of the people. So my dad said, kissed us goodbye and said, see you later, and he was gone. I still had mom and grandma. And a few days later, the same scenario takes place, except this time they ordered the women. This included my mom, of course. There she stood in front of me in her beautiful gray Persian lamb coat and a little knapsack and boots. And she tried so hard to put a smile on her face for me. Everything was to protect the child. And she looked at me and she said, honey, be a good girl, listen to grandma, and I'll see you soon. And with that, mom was gone, and I was 11 years old, and that's the last time I had ever seen her. The war raged on, and the Nazis kept pushing and pushing. And one day there's a knock at the door. And of course, we all stiffen, we all think it's the Nazis, and what do they want now? And to our surprise, it was my father. And he explained that he was in a cattle car, absolutely having no idea where they were going, but he was being deported someplace, and a couple of Nazi officers needed directions to Budapest. And that was his lucky day because he spoke a fluent German, and so he became their guide. And when they got back to Budapest, they let him go. So he comes in, and of course, he looks for my mother, and grandma and I tell him what happened. And immediately he said, I'm going after her. I know where they're collecting the people. They're collecting them at the brickyard. Well, as it turns out, they just about always collected the people at the brickyard because brickyards were situated on the railroad, and that facilitated deportations. And immediately I started tugging at his jacket. I said, Daddy, please don't leave me. Mommy's gone. Please, please don't go. And even my mother's mother, my grandmother, said to him, there's nothing you can do for her. And she was absolutely right. Had he gone after her, he would have disappeared also. So my dad stayed, and once again, a couple of days later, there's a knock at the door. And this time it's Julia, our housekeeper, a wonderful, loving Catholic lady who risked her life to save mine. If it wasn't for Julia, I would not be here telling you my story today. You know, all our stories are a little bit different, but the common denominator is always tragedy. So I don't know if Julia and my parents had decided this at an earlier date, or if she just took it upon herself to come and get me. But grandma threw a few articles of clothing into a brown paper bag, and we took off my yellow star and walked out of the building and got on a streetcar to go to her house. And now she reminded me of my Catholic school education. And she also taught me the rosary because that I did not know. And she felt an 11-year-old child, if they questioned her, should know. And she told me that we're going to tell the neighbors that my parents and I lived in Eastern Hungary, where the Russians were already occupying the country. And my parents sent me to my Aunt Julia to the big cities to get me away from the Russian occupation. She also warned me that one of her neighbors, Teresa, was a big Nazi sympathizer. I had to be very careful what I said. At 11, I knew enough to be afraid of people finding out that I am Jewish. So imagine the burden on an 11-year-old who knows that she can't cry out and say, I want to go home to mom and dad. I can't even laugh out loud because, and can't do anything that would bring attention to me. Julia and I slept in this big bed, and she put her arm around me, and I was very, very comfortable with her. Once again, I was with somebody I knew who loved me and would take care of me. And Julia had potatoes and beans and smoked meats in her pantry. So once again, I did not starve. She would bake bread, and well, life went on like this until one day it started raining bombs from the sky, and I mean nonstop. And now I am living in a 5-story apartment building. All these people head for the basement. There's a big stack of chopped wood, probably for firewood in the basement. Basement certainly is not built to be lived in. And we took pillows and blankets and couldn't take our coats off because there was no heat down there. And we made beds one next to the other on the stack of chopped wood. You can imagine how uncomfortable that must have been. And well, we lived by candlelight. It was dark, it was damp, it was dingy. It was absolutely miserable and way overcrowded. But the worst part of this living in the basement, there were no toilet facilities. And you have a 5-story apartment building full of people, and there's a bucket passed around for the waste, and the waste is thrown out in the dark of night. And either you get used to living with the stink, or you go out and get hit by a bomb. Not much choice there. And we lived like that for approximately 2 months. In between bombings, Julia would run upstairs and grab some food and bring it downstairs. And the building shook many times, and many times we wondered what's going to kill us first, the Nazis or the bombs, but neither one happened. And middle of January 1945, news started traveling from building to building that there was guerrilla warfare in the streets. The Russians were occupying Budapest, thereby freeing the Jews. And the bombing stopped, the machine gun fire abated, and finally we got up enough nerve to open the basement door. Well, imagine having been in a dark basement for a couple of months, and now you walk out and it's January and there's cold out and there's snow on the ground and the bright sun is reflecting off the snow. And of course, until your eyes adjust, you see nothing. But I could smell. And the only way to explain that smell was it was the smell of death. Dead bodies were all over the street. Dead horses were all over the street. People were so hungry, they were running out with carving knives, carving up the horses for a meal. But the war was over and we were free, and that was really totally at that point beyond our imagination. We went back up. One of Julia's building staircases was bombed out. The other one was accessible. We went up to her apartment. Everybody who was in that basement was full of lice. Julia, I think some kerosene or some kind of compound, and we got rid of the lice. And that was the least of our problems after what the life and death situation we had just survived. Now imagine a world without cell phones. Pretty hard today, isn't it? Well, imagine a world without even house phones. And that was the case in 1945 in Budapest. Julia had no house phone. And even if she would have had a phone, well, the lines were all bombed out, so there would have been no connection. So all we could do is hope and wait for somebody from the family to show up. And sometime later, as I was playing in front of her apartment, all of a sudden I look up and there comes my daddy. And oh my God, I was so happy. I flew into his arms. And my dad by nature was a very handsome, tall, very erect walking man. Well, now he was bent over. His skin color was off. Obviously, he was not well. And he came in, and slowly his story unfolded, a story of his survival unfolded. There was a Swedish diplomat by the name of Raoul Wallenberg, who was instructed to buy up as many apartment buildings as he could in Budapest and declared to the Nazis that these buildings are like the Swedish embassy, and whoever lives in these buildings is untouchable and hands off. And with some buildings it worked, and with other buildings it didn't. You also had to have a pass to move into one of these buildings. I don't know how expensive these passes were. I have no idea whether my dad bought a pass or some were real and some were fake, whatever, but Mr. Wallenberg saved over 10,000 Jews by these houses that he bought up. And so my dad told the story that food was very scarce. And to quote him, there wasn't even enough room to stretch a leg. Obviously, he needed rest and good food. Passenger trains were not running yet, and he took me on a freight train, much like he was being deported in, except this was going in the opposite direction. And we rode and we just got off at a small village. I have no idea what its name was. Doesn't even matter. And he negotiated with a farmer and his wife. And these people decided to take us in. Whether my father had some money, whether Julia, the only way he could have had some money was if Julia hid it for him. So I don't think that these farmers would have taken us in for nothing. But that lady made the most delicious bowl of scrambled eggs that night. I wolfed it down. I hadn't as much as seen an egg for at least the past 2 years. And the lady was a very good Hungarian cook, and there was good food and vegetables and fruits and livestock on a farm. And we ate and we slept. And the little village had a local soccer team. That's their natural sport. And my daddy enjoyed the soccer games, and I enjoyed being at his side. So it worked out fine. And that's what we did for amusement. And we lived there like for probably 2 or 3 weeks until my daddy started feeling better. And then we went back to our original apartment on Westfalenstair. Well, there was another family living there. This was a decent family because most families were everything they had left behind. And don't forget, we could only take what we could carry. That were stolen from them. This family left their belongings intact. So all I needed now was my family to be back, and we would have been fine. So for a brief time, until they were able to find a place to live, we actually shared the apartment with them. Transports of people kept returning from the various concentration camps. They were all sick, they were all skin and bones, telling absolute horror stories. Where is my mom? We have no idea. With every train load, I wondered, and mom wasn't there. And slowly life took on some normalcy. My father got his business back, and I went back to the Jewish gymnasium. The whole city, I don't think there was a building that left unscathed. I think every building was bombed. So now I got united with my little friends. And most interestingly, as I look back, we all had lived through such a horrific situation that none of us asked each other, how did you survive? Where are your parents? Do you have your parents? It was a deep, dark secret, and none of us dared to go there. Some of our teachers came back, some didn't. None of us ever talked about the war. I had a friend whose name happened to have been also Agnes, and she had a younger sister, Vera. And the parents, they all survived. And almost immediately after the war, they were very religious Jews, and there was no state of Israel yet. So they set out for Palestine, and of course, I never saw them again. But I hope they were successful with their trip, and they lived happily after that. Well, each day I'm waiting for my mother to come home, and she doesn't come, and she doesn't come. And then one day my dad came home from the store, and he told me that he found out that a few days after Julia took me, the Budapest ghetto was formed. And now all the Jews were pushed, all the Jews left in the Yellow Star or Jewish designated buildings were pushed into the ghetto, which was a much smaller area and of course much more crowded. And that's what happened to Grandma and my uncle and aunt. The Hungarian Nazi Party was very, very strong, and they knew that their days were numbered. They knew the war was coming to an end. So the Jews, although they were dropping dead like flies, and the lack of sanitation and the lack of food in the ghetto, that wasn't fast enough for them. So they would march a group down to the shores of the Danube and wire 8 or 10 people together, and with one bullet, they would sink them to the bottom of the icy river. And ladies and gentlemen, that was the fate of my darling grandmother and uncle and aunt, who were decent, law-abiding citizens, and Hungarian Jews were always Hungarian first and then Jewish. And their only sin had been that they had been born Jewish. And I don't know if any of you have been to post-war Hungary, but today I know that there is a monument of bronze shoes on the shores of the Danube commemorating all the blood that was shed into it. So I usually tell students that don't talk to me about the blue Danube. It's not a blue Danube, it's a very red Danube from all the blood shot into it. So now we knew that part of the family wasn't coming back. Now I'm going to go back a little bit because the American contingency of the family, my 2 uncles and aunts, kept urging my parents to immigrate. And my father's mantra was always, Jews have never had it so good in Budapest. I have a well-going business. And the rest of the family is here and we don't want to go anywhere. And around 1942, I think my parents finally woke up to some of the realities. And our immigration process actually started, and we got so far that we had all our papers. I remember these huge wicker baskets sitting in our living room packed with all our belongings and being shipped out. And they were in Lisbon already, when in the last minute, the Germans wouldn't give us the visa to go through their country. And that's how my family and I got caught up in the Holocaust. Would we have been able to immigrate at that time? My life would have gone very, very differently, but that was not to be. So now my dad came home and I saw he was crying, and he sat me down and he said a lady came into the store who was at the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp with my mother. And my mother died of so-called natural causes, probably typhus and starvation, in her arms on January the 13th, a Friday, 1945. So now we had nobody to wait for to come back. The family was all gone except for my dad and for myself. And now the immigration process, of course, my dad had contacted the American family as soon as he was able. But until we knew that we were the only two survivors, we didn't go anywhere. Now our immigration process started all over again. And in January 1947, my dad and I got on a train, a passenger train this time, and Julia saw us off, and she knew she'd never see me again. It was a very emotional time. And we rode to Berlin, where we spent the night in a bombed out hotel, but I was so used to bombed out buildings that that was nothing different than what I had seen in Budapest. And next day, my daddy and I got on a Pan Am propeller plane and flew out over the Atlantic. Well, it was a long plane ride. And during this ride, my dad was telling me all kinds of stories about this wonderful land where we were going. And I sometimes today, I wonder if he even believed the stories himself, or was he just trying to make his little girl feel good? I don't know. But some of the stories he told me were that Americans were all rich. They didn't wash clothes. They just threw it out and bought new. The streets were paved with milk and honey. And above all, my three cousins in America were all boys. And therefore, I would, as the only girl, I'd be the princess. And that didn't quite work out that way. So my mother's younger sister, Betsy, and her husband, Eugene, had two boys. And Eugene came to New York and met us. Well, along the way, before we got to New York, we had to make an emergency landing because there was such a storm over the Atlantic that everybody prayed and vomited, not necessarily in that order. And so we made this emergency landing, and they put us up in barracks. I was supposed to go one side with the women and my dad on the other side with the men. And I wouldn't leave my daddy's side, so I stayed with him. And next day, they took us into this beautiful white table, a dining room, white tablecloth dining room. And I have absolutely no idea what they fed us. I'm sure it was good, but I had never seen an ice cube in a glass. And oh my God, that was my first memory really of this new land that we were going to. They have ice cubes in glasses. In Hungary, the iceman brought the ice in big blocks. So next day, the storm died down and we finished our trip and we got off in New York, and there was my Uncle Eugene waiting for us. And we took a train, a Pullman car to Chicago. where I met my new family, my mother's younger sister, Betsy, and their two sons, Paul and Tom. Oh my God, I was bewildered. I took some English lessons in school, and I thought I could speak some English, but the spoken English and what I had learned were like night and day. I kept wanting to tell people, slow down, maybe I'll understand you. I was with strange people in a strange country with strange habits. These people said they loved me, they hugged me, they kissed me, but this was not the family I grew up with. I knew nothing about them. And then my other uncle and aunt, the two physicians, came over and they heard my dad coughing. And immediately they sent him for a chest x-ray. Well, first of all, my dad slept on a daybed in the dining room, and they had like a den that they fixed up for a bedroom for me. So, but my dad went for a chest x-ray, and he was diagnosed with tuberculosis. Today, tuberculosis is relatively easily curable. Those days, a TB patient had to be isolated, and off to Winfield Sanitarium he went. So now I am all alone with all these strangers, and I don't speak their language. The kids don't speak Hungarian, so everybody speaks English at home, and they enrolled me in school. I should have been in the 8th grade. I was 13 by now, and because of the language difficulty, I was in the 3rd grade. Little kids are wonderful teachers because they speak a simple language. And also each and every one was so proud to teach me a word here and there. They would pick up an object and say, pencil, this is a pencil. Chalk, this is a chalk. And well, when you're young, you learn the language quickly. As I said, nobody at home spoke Hungarian either. And I was told to look in the dictionary and pick 10 words that I could learn every day. And Saturday afternoons, I used to go with I made friends at school in the 8th graders. And so we went to matinees on Saturday afternoon, and that's a good way to learn the language also. We saw a double feature, and I got 50 cents allowance, and on that I could see 2 movies and buy some popcorn. So the value of money. Anyhow, these American people were very shocked when they saw me, because they expected to see a skinny little ravished girl, and instead they got a chubby child. Well, they kept sending us goodie packages with Hershey bars and cream soups, and of course I ate them all, and they tasted so good after, I mean, we had powdered eggs and powdered milk even after the war. So anyhow, they decided that I had to lose weight, and they put me on every kind of diet you could think of. And can you imagine? Well, my cousin and I were still in grammar school, and we came home for lunch, and Tom sat down with 2 huge bologna sandwiches with mayo and lettuce and tomato, and I got a bowl of dry cottage cheese with some green pepper. And this didn't sit well with me, and I didn't dare open my mouth and complain. And also, my daddy said I'd be the princess. But because I was the only girl, I was the one who was asked to set the table and wash the dishes. And princesses don't do stuff like that. So I had been totally misled. But I never could complain. One of my biggest losses was the unconditional love of my parents. And every child is entitled to that. And as far as overeating, well, nobody realized that I had a big hole in my heart for all the people I'd lost, who I loved. and I was trying to fill that hole with the food. There were no counselors around like you have them today. And all I heard at home is don't talk about the Holocaust. Don't talk about it. Look forward, assimilate, learn the language. And I was never told to forget I was a Jew, but came pretty close to it. The American family certainly wasn't religious. So I kind of got ingrained in me that's very scary to be Jewish. Now, I learned enough English after a year that I could go on to high school. And I even made a little speech on the podium. And just about at the same time, my dad was finally pronounced negative. And my daddy was coming home to me, and I had all kinds of dreams that he's going to make a home for me and we'll live together. To the contrary, my dad told my uncle that he couldn't assimilate and he couldn't learn the language and he wants to go back to Europe. I didn't know this at first. My uncle, God bless him, told my dad that if he insists on going back, he'll pay his way, but in no way will he pay for him to take the child back to the country where they murdered her family. And I did not appreciate it when he did that, but boy, oh boy, do I appreciate it since I've grown up. So when I was 14 years old, my dad went back to Hungary, and I was left alone with a strange family who kept telling me how much they loved me, but I didn't believe a word of it. And my high school years were truly very tough emotionally. I did all okay in school, especially for an immigrant who was still learning the language. I got mostly A's and B's. My cousins now are getting older and they were going off to college. Well, I wanted to go to college too, but that was not in this family's plan. I don't think they had ever considered that I would want to go to college. My uncle wanted me to take some courses on typing and shorthand, stuff like that, so I could get a job in an office. Nobody asked me what I wanted to do. I was never good at learning to type at that time because they said I had a lack of coordination. I just wasn't interested. So I even went to my school counselor and I talked to her about going to college. And she also gave me bad advice. She said, just finish high school and worry about that later. I did not know that you could get scholarships. I did not know you could get grants or you could work your way through school. I had no idea. So I kind of figured that out for myself, that my mom wanted me to be a doctor and that obviously wasn't possible. But I could go to nursing school and live away from home and learn something. And I applied at Mount Sinai Hospital's nursing school. And not only was I accepted, but I got a scholarship. So that was my new plan after I graduate high school. I was going to go to nursing school. Well, I was a senior in high school. When a friend, and you know, my girlfriends were dating. I was even afraid to look at a boy. And amongst many things this family told me, and they meant well, God bless them, but it was the worst thing they could have said to me because my self-esteem was in the basement. Anyhow, after all, everybody I loved had deserted me, but they told me that if I was getting too fat, nobody will love me. So that's preyed on my mind. And of course, I didn't stop eating. So, okay, in my senior year in my high school, my girlfriend said, would you like to go on a blind date? And I said, why not? And I went. And that's where I met Danny. And Danny changed my life once again, 160 degrees. By golly, there was a boy in the world who liked me. And he liked me so much that he kept calling and coming over and dating me. And he started telling me he loved me. And within 6 weeks, he proposed. And I went to school next day and I told my best friend that Danny proposed. Well, Sylvia said, "What did you say?" And I said, "Well, I guess I accepted." And with that, like wildfire, it went through Sun High School. Agnes is getting married. My friends were going to college, but I was getting married. Now I was the belle of the ball. And there was no going back on it. Well, when I talk to young people at this point, I always tell them, please finish your education because you never know when life will call on you to make a living. But I think I'm talking to an adult audience, so that really wasn't necessary. So the following October, Danny and I had just a very small family wedding, and I became Mrs. Daniel Kittay. And for the first time since I was in the United States, I was happy. Danny didn't like the cold weather, so a few months after, well, first we got an apartment in Hyde Park. It was just a studio apartment, but it was a nice place, and we started furnishing it. Then Danny one day said, let's move to a warm climate. And he flew down to Houston to check it out. And he came back and he was very much like Houston. And so we decided to move down there. We were two kids. He was 4 years older than I was. He was a recent graduate of the Braille Institute. Television was in its infancy in the United States. Everybody needed a new tube, a new this and that, and he was expert at that, so he could make a living. Never made a good living, but I was happy. And well, Houston was a revelation to me because my mother had read me books about America and slavery, but I thought those were all fairy tales. And we got to Houston, and there were white water fountains and black, and white washrooms and black washrooms. And I said, what is this? I thought I came to the land of the free. Well, that was before the civil rights movement, and we were right in the midst of it. After I worked in the store with Danny while I could, and I got pregnant and I had a baby. So I had a beautiful little boy, Stephen, 8 pounds, 6 ounces. And then I stayed home. And he hired a black technician at the store who was a very clean-cut man, but he was black. And the neighbors who had a jewelry store and with whom we shared a washroom went to the landlord complaining that they don't want to share a washroom with a black man. I couldn't imagine. These people came from Southern Illinois. I could not imagine anybody complaining about that. Anyhow, the business folded when Stephen was 7 months. We moved back to Chicago, and then he got a job. I had 2 more children in Chicago, a little boy, Billy, and I wanted a little girl very badly. And the little girl came a little sooner than I would have liked, but 14 months later, I had a little girl, and now I had my family, and I have 3 little kids who call me mommy, and I adored being a mommy. I adored being a housewife. I like to cook. It was a wonderful life, even though financially we're not doing well. Somehow that mattered very little to me because I thought that was coming. Then he had an accident whereby he was hurt pretty badly, and there was a lawsuit, and we got a little money, enough to make a down payment on a home, and we moved into our house. And now I had a home and 3 little kids and a husband, and life was still very, very good. And it went on like that for 13 years. And after 13 years, my husband started telling funny stories. Well, they were weird stories. And the first one that stands out to me was that he was teaching trade school in the evening, and that I shouldn't say anything on the telephone because the telephones at work are bugged. And I had absolutely no reason not to believe him. I have always believed anything and everything he told me. So that was the first one. And then they kept getting more and more sophisticated, his stories. And he kept quitting jobs, but he always found another one. And then one day he called me and he threatened to jump off, commit suicide. And then I knew I had to get help. And with the help of his uncle and aunt coming to babysit, I got him to Michael Reese Hospital, which had a psychiatric ward. It was a very fine hospital in Chicago at that time. And we went to the emergency room, and immediately he was admitted to the psychiatric ward. The doctor told me that there are acute cases that pass very quickly, and then there are other cases that become chronic and stay with the patient. He also advised me to contact the Jewish Federation for supportive therapy. That's the best advice anybody could have given me at that time. I got lucky and I got a wonderful therapist, and my life now started to unfold and why I did the things I did. Well, Danny was discharged after 6 weeks of medication. And a doctor wouldn't give me a diagnosis. I read all the psychiatric books I could lay my hands on that I could understand, and I diagnosed him from a layman's book. His symptoms were so classic. He was a paranoid schizophrenic. And I told the doctor, and of course he could not deny it. Well, I also know that paranoid schizophrenics can be very dangerous, and I started worrying for the lives of my children. And Michael Reese Hospital only took acute psychiatric patients, and then he had become chronic. And I asked the doctor if I could, well, he refused to, as a typical paranoid schizophrenic, he refused to take his medication because he was fine. It's the whole world that was out of step with him. So I suggested to the doctor that I put his medication in his coffee. And he said, don't do that, because if he finds it at the bottom of the cup, he's going to think in his frame of mind, you're trying to poison him, and who knows what he can do. So I didn't. Well, then he went back and forth to the hospital with Michael Reese a few times, and then after that, they wouldn't take him. And I started committing him to Kankakee State Hospital, which was probably more than an hour's drive. Oh, excuse me, let me just hang up.
Call from Virgin Sarah. Call from Virgin Sarah.
Better I'm on a Zoom. That was a survivor friend. Okay, I'm sorry. But if I don't answer, it will just ring and ring. So anyhow, I had him committed several times. the social worker was so good to me that, which is an absolute no-no. She gave me her home phone number and she would go to court with me to have Danny committed. And after much therapy and 2 years of struggle, I decided to get a divorce. It's very hard to make peace with the fact that you're going to divorce somebody you love and their only problem is being sick. You know, most women get a divorce because their husband is a womanizer or a drunkard. My husband was just plain old sick. And would I leave him if he had cancer or some other terrible disease? Of course not. But I was afraid of him. And after 2 years, I did get a divorce. My neighborhood had changed. I needed to move. And with a dog and 2 cats and 3 kids, I found an apartment, a condo apartment in Skokie. And off we went to Skokie, to a new world. My oldest son was already in college. The other kids were still in grammar school. My Billy had a very hard time growing up because he was very close to his father. And he was actually a high school dropout. And I had a very rough time with him as a teenager. Unfortunately, he grew up to be a wonderful dad himself and a great human being. The other 2 went on to college. Billy was very clever with his hands. He is chief engineer at one of the Hilton hotels in New Mexico. He ended up raising his only son from the time he was about 11 years old himself. He himself had gone through a divorce. And well, ladies and gentlemen, that's mostly, well, no, the 3 kids gave me 4 grandchildren. And I am also proud of each and every one of them. They all have secondary degrees. I have a pharmacist, I have an electrical engineer, a physical therapist, and a human resources master's degree. So who can ask for anything more? They're living the life I would have liked for myself, but good for them. And as a bonus, well, they've given me 4 great-grandchildren, 2 in Florida and 2 in Colorado. And I recently learned that my granddaughter, who is the youngest grandchild, is expecting her first baby. So I have much to look forward to. And Hitler, I fooled you. My family multiplied in spite of you. I'd love to answer some questions you might have. Perhaps you'd like to know when I started to speak or what happened to Julia. So, but I don't want to deny you the opportunity to ask these questions. But otherwise, I'll just tell you about them.
Agnes, thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
I always love to listen to you and see you. And I would encourage everybody to turn your cameras on so she can see you too, if you can, and if you would like. And if anyone has any questions, you can either just take yourself off mute and ask, because we have a relatively small group here tonight, or you can put it in the chat and I will ask her. And we're both holding up Agnes's book.
Memoir. It's available through Kale and Amanda and Scott, and they have some in the office. And if you're interested in more of my story, well, there's much more detail in here.
Well, and you totally beat me to it, because this is the beautiful 2nd edition
Yes.
that was put out by the Spungen Family Foundation. And so I will
Yes.
just put a little plug in for our program tomorrow night, which is Danny Spungen and Kiel Majewski from the Spungen Foundation. So you can tune in and hear them tomorrow night, but let me know. The books are $18.
If you need the link for tomorrow night's Zoom, please just send me an email and I'll get that out to you in the
Yeah.
moment.
But for now, let's take some questions for Agnes. Anybody have a question? I know you already read my mind, Agnes, because of course I was thinking right away. What happened to Julia?
Julia, well, my relationship with my dad was absolutely ruined. And to this day, there are days when I am willing to forgive him, and there are days when I am not. I'm very ambivalent on this. I don't know how he could leave his only child alone. But anyhow, I got a letter from him that Julia passed away. And by that time I was grown. And I started corresponding with the museum in Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. And I wanted her in the Avenue of the Righteous Christians. And it took 2 years of correspondence with them before they would accept her, because they kept asking for proof. And they just had to accept my word for it. And finally, I did get her in there. And they wanted to send me papers and a plaque. And no, they wanted to send it to her family. Well, she has no, as far as I knew, she had no family. So nobody got the papers, but I have a certificate that they had taken her. And I was in Israel about 13 years ago. And I was there at Yad Vashem, and I can't begin to tell you how everything came back to me and how I cried my eyes out, because I felt like I was at her grave, and that when I was a child, I truly did not understand how she risked her life to save mine.
I think it takes incredible courage.
Pardon?
It takes incredible courage, I think. And yet, with some people, and I imagine Julia was one of those, it comes absolutely natural.
She loved me. You know, a child asked me some time ago, if the shoe was on the other foot, would I save a life? And it would have been very easy for me, of course. But there's a big but there. People were afraid, because if the Nazis found out they were harboring Jews, they came and killed the whole family. So would I have, if I had children, a husband, parents? I don't know. You know, that's a question you can't answer unless you're right in that situation.
Yes, I agree.
Let me
Anyone else?
a little bit about my dad. He went back to Europe and he ended up remarrying. And today, as a grown-up, I understand that a 40-some-year-old, even close to 50, wanted to get remarried, but he happened to marry a woman with 2 children, one a boy and the other one a little girl. And would I have been any happier if I moved back to Hungary with him? Of course not. Living in another woman's home who had 2 children. So.
Well, in that, you almost read Carolyn's mind. She put a question in the chat asking whether you stayed in touch with your father.
I stayed in touch with my father sporadically. His wife wrote me that he had been very sick, and she obviously took good care of him, and I'm thankful for that. My father erected a beautiful marble monument in a cemetery in Hungary. I have a photograph of it. All the names of my mother's family are on that monument. And my cousin went to Hungary, and they went to the cemetery, and the cemetery keeper showed them the plot. And the beautiful monument has been desecrated. So Hungary is still a very anti-Semitic country. It always was, and I think it always will be.
And they're having a great deal of difficulty in that regard right now.
Yes.
Kevin asked if you had a career outside the home.
Of course. Well, I had to have a career. I had 3 children to support. So my referral to the JUF referred me to the Jewish Vocational Service, because I was just out of high school. And they wanted to send me to college. And I said, I'd love to go, but now somebody wants to send me to college, you know. But I have 3 kids to put a roof over their head and put food on the table. So I went to business college for a year and I became a very good stenographer, which is a dying art today, but I was very good at that. And I became a good typist in spite of myself. Anyhow, I went to work for Wilson and Company, the meat packers and the sporting goods people. They had an office downtown. And then I started asking questions about where there is better pay scale. And I heard that it was in law offices. And I got a job with a handshake at a law office. I knew absolutely nothing about law. It was a whole new vocabulary, a whole new world that opened to me. And I learned to love it. And I was on that job for 7 years. And luck and maybe God was with me, and the office manager retired. I got promoted. I got a nice increase in salary. And I would have probably stayed there with them forever until I retired, except both senior partners died. And I could not get along with the person who took over. On my last job as office manager, I was for 17 years. Well, okay, I got to go back a little bit and tell you that I dated while I was single between marriages, and then when the kids were all grown, I met a man and we got married. That would be 40 years ago now. He died 20 years ago, and so how did I jump to this? I lost
You were going to tell us about your last job.
my last job. So we talked about it after we got married, that I'd worked for 5 years. I ended up staying for 17 years. And I only left then, well, I was close to 65 already, but my husband got very sick and he needed me at home. And I absolutely loved that job. I write in detail about that job. Yeah.
In the book. Did you ever go back to Hungary,
And
Agnes?
no, I have never gone back to Hungary. I entertained that thought because my daughter wanted to go with me, but I had nobody left there. And then came 9/11, and that absolutely settled that I would never go back to Europe. I have always been scared of Europe. My second husband wanted to take me to London, and I wouldn't go. I've been to Hawaii, I've been to the Caribbean, but Europe is not a place for me.
I really appreciate how the detail that you tell your story and the vulnerability that you have, because I think a lot of times it's hard to hear, and we don't want to think about the trauma that comes from such an awful experience as yours and how that follows you throughout your life. So
What I wanted to say is that although I was not in a concentration camp, and I was very lucky that way, it has affected my entire life. The decisions I have made throughout my life because of as a result of losing my mother. That was the main catalyst for what I did. Not feeling comfortable at home.
And just the inability to even talk about it or process it, or
so
anyone.
Important, Kale, to talk about it because my generation is dying out. And I moved to I met survivors for the first time since I moved to Skokie. Until then, I didn't know any survivors. And I became so comfortable with them. And then my oldest grandson, well, my daughter's oldest child, my daughter raised 3 kids in Florida, and I was vacationing there, and I went to, so he was in 8th grade, and he said to me, "Grandma, we're studying the Holocaust. Would you come to my school and talk about it?" And I was really taken back because nobody had ever wanted to hear about the Holocaust. And I said, Jonathan, I'm not sure I can. But I spent a sleepless night. I made some notes and I did it. And I got such a wonderful reception from the kids that was the beginning of me speaking out. Then I spoke at his brother's 8th grade class and his sister's. And then I got involved with the Illinois Holocaust Museum, and I have spoken all over, certainly all over Illinois. I've spoken all the way to, thanks to you, Kale, to Calgary. I have another Zoom coming up beginning of April in Calgary.
You're going international this year.
And yeah, and I hope to be there in person next year.
Well, and when I was putting together an introduction, I had to go back and back and back. You have been, this is the 11th year that we've done the Week of Understanding program, which predates me. You've been coming to speak since 2013.
I know it's been a long time. I just couldn't remember how long. Yeah.
Well, you are a dear, dear friend of the Institute for Holocaust
I know.
Education, and I am so grateful.
Donna was the first one I met there.
Yep, Donna is on this call.
Hi, Donna.
Hi,
Yes.
Agnes.
Up
You look
there.
you look absolutely beautiful tonight. Thanks again for sharing your story.
You're welcome. You're welcome. I wish more people would have tuned in.
We do too. We also know that Zoom fatigue is real. Most of us spend our days on Zoom on meetings, but we are so grateful that you gave us this time. And I know that I will see you in about 12 hours or 14 hours. You're going to speak for some students in the morning for Omaha Public Schools. And so we should probably let you go get your beauty sleep. Oh, wait, maybe I should go get my beauty sleep.
Me too.
But thank you very much for tuning in. Don't forget, I have books. Just let me know if you would like one. I will deliver it. I will hand deliver it, sanitized and masked. Let me know if you would like
I
that.
can't do a virtual autograph, but it will have to do.
No, but it is blessed. And this is a beautiful second edition, Agnes. It really is.
Thank
So
you for inviting me, and thank you for
Pleasure
inviting.
to have you. Thank you.
And
Right.
Amanda,
Your
thank you to
home.
Tri-Faith for co-hosting this with us. It is so good to see you. Again, it
thank
kind
you,
of feels like the old
Amanda.
team is back together for a
Yeah.
short time. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Have a good night
Good
and a
evening.
great week. Thank you.
Bye.
Good night. Be well.
Good night.
Thank you, Agnes. I'll see you in the morning. We're going to start at 9:50.
Not me.
Oh, no, that's Wednesday, isn't it?
Yeah.
See, I don't even know what day it is. I'm glad you know what day it is.
I didn't want to say something